The movie begins with Jessica, a woman who had recently lost her husband, packing her belongings into a cargo trailer in preparation for a significant road trip. She meticulously arranges her items, ensuring everything is securely stowed away, and once her preparations are complete, she pulls out her smartphone and opens a mapping application, and the screen reveals that Jessica is embarking on a 4-day journey. As she sets off, the initial stretch of the trip is smooth and uneventful. However, as she progresses further, the surroundings begin to change. The highway becomes less populated, and dense woods start to envelop the road. Eventually, Jessica finds herself driving down a secluded and quiet road, and up ahead, she notices a black car behaving unusually. The car was moving at a frustratingly low pace, impeding her progress. After several unsuccessful attempts and growing increasingly impatient, Jessica decides she's had enough. She presses down on the accelerator and swerves into the other lane, determined to bypass the obstructive vehicle. However, as she speeds up, the black car mirrors her actions, matching her speed precisely and blocking her from returning to the right lane. To make matters worse, a massive truck suddenly appears in the distance, heading straight toward her. The black car, however, remains stubbornly unwilling to slow down or let her pass. Panic begins to set in as Jessica realizes the danger of her situation. With the truck rapidly approaching, she gathers her courage and makes a daring maneuver as she accelerates even more, narrowly squeezing past the black car just moments before the truck barrels past her. However, the black car accelerates once again, catching up to her and relentlessly honking its horn. Finally, they reach an intersection where their paths diverge. Jessica takes the turn and pulls over at a safe spot, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, and she takes deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart and steady her nerves. Later that evening, Jessica stops at a gas station to refuel her car, and while pumping gas, she decides to call her father. Their conversation reveals a strained relationship between Jessica and her mother, despite her father's pleas for a reconciliation. As she speaks, something catches her eye. She glances up and sees the familiar black car from earlier, pulling up into the gas station. She watches intently as the car lingers for a moment, before quickly driving away. The brief encounter leaves her feeling uneasy, but she tries to brush it off. After finishing the call and filling up her tank, Jessica decides it's time to rest. She drives to a small motel in the nearby town. She checks in and heads to her room, and finally allows herself to relax. While resting in her motel room, Jessica's phone rings. She glances at the caller ID and sees that it's her mother, and despite her father's earlier plea for reconciliation, she hesitates and ultimately decides not to answer. Instead, she turns her attention to a collection of photographs. These pictures, capturing moments of joy and love with her late husband, bring a flood of emotions. She reminisces about the good times that they shared. Sadness wells up inside her, and she allows herself to cry, releasing some of the grief that she'd been carrying. Eventually, she wipes away her tears and prepares to go to bed. The next morning, Jessica gets ready to continue her journey, and just as she was about to leave the hotel, a man with a cast on his arm approaches her. His appearance is quite unsettling, and there's something about his demeanor that puts her on edge. Jessica was taken aback when the man with the arm cast introduces himself as the driver in the black car. He awkwardly apologizes for his behavior the previous day, explaining that he was texting while driving and didn't realize the trouble that he was causing. Despite his apology though, Jessica felt really uneasy. The man continued to ask her questions, probing into her personal life. He inquires if she lives nearby and where she's headed, his curiosity making her increasingly uncomfortable. Sensing the creepiness of the situation, Jessica quickly excuses herself, cutting the conversation short, and she then resumes her journey. Soon after, Jessica finally leaves the town and finds herself driving on a highway that cuts through a dense forest. After some time on the road, she is surprised to once again encounter the black car, this time parked squarely in the middle of the road. The same shady stranger stands behind it, looking distressed, and Jessica's weariness intensifies. She immediately locks her car doors and cautiously rolls down her window just a crack, and the man begins to plead his case, claiming that his car engine had died. He asks for her help, requesting a ride to the nearest gas station. Worried about her safety, Jessica cautiously suggests that she could drive to the nearest gas station and send a mechanic to help him. However, the man adamantly refuses her offer, insisting that she get out and help him directly. His persistence only highlights her suspicion and fear. Acting on her instincts, Jessica does not take any chances, and she hits the gas pedal and speeds away, leaving the man and his black car behind. She breathes heavily as she drives away. It's not until much later that night when exhaustion finally overcomes her fear, and she takes her next stop at another gas station. While taking a breath and smoking, Jessica finally answers her mother's call. Her mom, clearly upset, chastises her for leaving town without informing the family. Just as the conversation starts to get emotional, to her shock and dismay, the same black car pulls into the parking lot and enters the resting area. Panic sets in as she realizes the man is undoubtedly following her. Without wasting a moment, Jessica quickly ends the call and hurries back to her car. Her hands tremble as she starts the engine. As expected, the stranger approaches her window, but Jessica doesn't wait to hear what he had to say. She starts to drive away, and just as she thinks she's lost him, a white van suddenly swoops in, blocking her path. This maneuver gives the stranger another chance to catch up to her. He reaches her window, insists that he's just there to use the bathroom, and accuses Jessica of overreacting. His attempt to downplay the situation does nothing to ease her fear, and ignoring his comments, Jessica keeps her focus on the van, waiting for it to move. As soon as the van shifts out of the way, Jessica takes her chance, and she quickly maneuvers around it and drives off. She begins driving as fast as she can, her eyes frequently darting to the rearview mirror, where she can still see the black car following her. With her fear mounting, she decides to call 911 to report that she's being followed. Her frustration grows when the operator asks for her precise location, which she cannot accurately provide. As the black car begins to speed up, her panic intensifies, and she grips the steering wheel tighter, her mind racing through possible escape routes. But then, to her astonishment, the black car overtakes her and disappears into the night. Realizing it wasn't the shady stranger's car after all, she felt a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. Still shaken, she continues driving, her heart pounding from the adrenaline. She then informs the 911 operator that the report was a false alarm and starts to calm down a little bit. However, her relief was short-lived. Suddenly, she loses control of her car, which derails to the side of the road. And alarmed, she steps out and checks and discovers that one of her cargo trail tires has bursted. As she assesses the situation, the black car appears again, driving toward her, and without wasting a second, she quickly unhooks the cargo trailer from her car and climbs back into the driver's seat. This time, the shady stranger abandons any pretense of being a nice guy, and with a swift and violent motion, he breaks her car window. Jessica fights back, but he overpowers her with his strength and quickly injects her with a sedative. Her vision blurs and she loses consciousness, and the next day, she awakens in a dimly lit, unfamiliar room. Disoriented and groggy, she notices the windows are barred and the view outside reveals a lawn enclosed by barbed wire fences. She cautiously approaches the locked door and peers through the small gap, hoping to find something, anything, that could help her understand where she is or how to escape. The hallway beyond was empty and silent, offering no clues or signs of life. She then hears footsteps outside the room, which belong to none other than the shady stranger, and he looks at her with a smug expression, dismissing her desperate pleas for freedom with a stern warning to keep quiet. The man doesn't return until later that night, and he shines a flashlight into the pitch-black room, and as he approaches her with a lewd smile, Jessica's fear intensifies. Desperately, she pleads for mercy once more, offering him money in exchange for her freedom. The man doesn't budge, and instead, he creepily replies that she's not the first person to offer him money, revealing with a chilling satisfaction that he's actually a serial killer. With a twisted smile, he commands her to take off her clothes, and desperate and terrified, Jessica tries to outsmart him by claiming she needs to use the bathroom. But as soon as she makes a break for the door, he intercepts her, violently knocking her to the ground. He drags her to the center of the room and kneels over her, his weight pinning her down. As he caresses her face with a grotesque tenderness, Jessica's mind races, searching for any possible escape. Her heart sinks when he takes out her iPad and starts playing a video, and the screen lights up with a photograph of her late husband. The man watches her reaction with twisted delight, savoring the torment that he was inflicting. Jessica's fear and sorrow mix as she lies there, feeling utterly helpless under his control. He then notices the wedding ring Jessica wears on a necklace and asks if her husband divorced her. She eventually admits that her husband took his own life. Unsatisfied with this response, the killer forces her to divulge the gruesome details, making her admit that her husband shot himself and that she was the one who found his lifeless body. The man left exhausted and terrified, and she eventually drifted into a fitful sleep. In the morning, she awakens with a renewed sense of urgency, and she immediately tries the door, but it doesn't budge. She examines the keyhole and notices that the key is still on the other side of the door, but she flattens her jacket and slides it under the door. Then she started bumping the door so that the key would fall on the jacket, and her attempts were futile, so she scanned the room and saw that there was a nail on the wall. She went there and pulled it as much as she could, and using the nail, she pushes the key out of the lock, watching as it falls onto her jacket outside the door. With steady hands, she gently slides the jacket back inside, bringing the key with it. She quickly uses it to unlock the door and makes her way out. Just as she steps into the hallway, she hears the front door opening. The serial killer had returned from grocery shopping. Jessica scrambles to a nearby closet. She peers through the small gap in the closet door, trying to control her breathing as he enters the room. The serial killer seems unaware of her escape attempt, distracted by his phone ringing. As he answers the call, Jessica listens intently. To her surprise, the conversation was with his family. He appears to be talking to his young daughter, his tone sweet and gentle. He instructs her to say hi to mommy and explains that his business trip is taking a bit longer than expected. After hanging up, the killer heads downstairs, making his way to the basement. Seizing this opportunity, Jessica quickly slips out of the closet and makes a break for the door. Her worst fears are confirmed when she hears the serial killer's enraged shouts behind her, and he's realized she's escaped and is now in pursuit. Jessica pushes herself to run faster, weaving through the trees and trying to lose him in the dense forest. And suddenly she trips and falls hard to the ground, wincing as she realizes a twig had punctured her foot. The pain was excruciating, her scream of pain echoing through the trees and drawing the killer's attention. Despite the agony, Jessica forces herself to get up and limp forward. She soon reaches a river, realizing she has no choice but to step into the water as the killer closes in. She jumps inside the river, letting the stream carry her away from the immediate danger. She struggles to keep her head above the surface, and the current sweeps her downstream, taking her further into the woods. After what feels like an eternity, the current finally deposits her on the riverbank, and exhausted but alive, she gasps for breath, and she pulls herself out of the water and onto the solid ground. Despite the pain in her foot, she continues to move through the woods, using a sturdy stem as a makeshift cane to help her walk. Suddenly, she hears footsteps nearby. Her heart skips a beat, fearing that the killer had found her. She quickly hides behind a tree, holding her breath and waiting for the person to come closer. As the footstep approaches, she musters all her strength and hits the approaching figure with a stem. The man staggers back, clearly taken by surprise. She realizes with horror that it's not the killer but an old hunter. The man, dazed and confused, looks up at her, and Jessica immediately apologizes, her voice trembling with desperation. She begs for his help, explaining that someone was trying to kill her, pleading to borrow his phone. The hunter, seeing her distressed state and understanding the gravity of the situation, nods and hands over his phone. Unfortunately, the phone was broken from the earlier hit, and the hunter, feeling sorry for Jessica and understanding her desperation, offers his wife's hunting boots, giving her some relief from the pain in her foot, and they then set off together. As they drive, the hunter kindly offers Jessica his lunch sandwich, and she gratefully accepts the food, helping to restore a bit of her strength. The hunter speaks soothingly, doing his best to reassure her and keep her panic at bay. Their progress is abruptly halted when they encounter a fallen tree blocking the road, and Jessica's fear resurfaces, and she frantically tries to move the tree out of the way, but despite her best efforts, it was too heavy for her to budge. Seeing her distressed, the hunter steps in, trying to calm her down, and he reassures her that they will find another way and that she is safe with him. As if on cue, the killer drives up toward them. The old hunter tells her to stay calm and approaches the car, and the killer steps out and spins a story. He claims that Jessica is his mentally unstable sister who ran away from home. His composed demeanor and very convincing lie causes the hunter to hesitate, unsure of whom to believe. The hunter starts to lean toward believing the killer, and he steps aside, allowing the man to approach Jessica. The killer then tries to apprehend her, but his rough handling immediately raises the hunter's suspicions. Sensing the danger, he raises his gun and firmly orders the killer to release Jessica. The killer, realizing he's lost the hunter's trust, reluctantly lets her go, and the hunter keeps his gun trained on the killer. Confused hunter demands to borrow the killer's phone. However, the killer had no intention of cooperating, and he viciously beats the hunter, leaving him bloody and battered, before grabbing the hunter's rifle and shooting him to finish the job. Meanwhile, Jessica runs deeper into the woods, and as night falls, a storm begins to rage, and she finds a temporary haven by a large rock. Exhausted and soaked, she takes a moment to catch her breath, and unlucky for her, the killer was relentless, and armed with the hunter's rifle and a flashlight, he methodically searches the woods. Jessica, huddled by the rock, watches the man as he scans the area. Once Jessica thinks it's safe, she cautiously moves to leave her hiding spot. However, the killer was still lurking nearby and shoots her in the leg. Despite the injury, she manages to slip past him and hides under a dense thicket of bushes. The killer, now frustrated, begins to taunt her. He calls out into the darkness, telling her that with a gunshot wound, she has about 2 hours before she bleeds to death. He suggests she come out now to face him while she still has some strength left. To further mock her, the killer places the rifle on the ground and steps back, and he declares that she has 1 minute to try and grab the gun, offering her a false sense of hope. He mentions her dead husband, calling him a coward in an attempt to spark her anger and lure her out. The longer Jessica remains hidden, the more impatient he becomes. His taunts turn to shouts as he threatens to come and get her. Jessica, however, stays resolute, and she doesn't fall for his bait and refrains from going for the rifle. Instead, she waits silently until he finally gives up on his twisted game, picks up the rifle, and just walks away. Once she was certain he was gone, she slowly emerges from her hiding spot and she finds a tree to rest under. And the following morning, she wakes up still in the middle of the forest. Her body aches, but she forces herself to keep moving through the difficult terrain. As she presses on, she hears the sound of a running car, and her heart sinks when she realizes it belongs to the killer. She watches as the killer pulls the dead hunter's body from the car and drags it to a grave he had dug. While he was preoccupied with burying the body, Jessica seizes the opportunity and stealthily approaches the car. To her relief, the door was unlocked, and quietly slipping inside, she frantically searches for anything that might help her. She rummages through the glove compartment and seats, and finally she finds his phone. She quickly grabs it, but unfortunately, just as she finds the phone, the killer finishes burying the hunter. Jessica quickly rolls into the back of the car, hiding herself as he re-enters the vehicle and starts driving again. In the cramped space, she finds a tire wrench and grips it tightly, ready to defend herself if necessary. She tries dialing 911, but struggles to communicate without making any noise, managing to only whisper a few garbled words before the call disconnects. It doesn't take long for the killer to notice his phone was missing, and he glances around the car, a suspicious look crossing his face. Realizing her time is running out before her position was compromised, she bursts out of the back seat and starts beating the killer with a tire wrench. Enraged, the man drives like a maniac, swerving wildly as he tries to stab her with his hunting knife. She fights back fiercely, landing a hard blow on his arm that forces him to drop the knife. Seizing the opportunity, she wraps the tire wrench around his neck and chokes him with all her strength. The killer struggles, but she manages to stab him in the wrist, causing him to lose control of the steering wheel. The car steers off the road and crashes violently. The impact leaves Jessica dazed, but she summons the strength to crawl out of the wreckage. Just as she fears she might collapse, she looks up and sees a helicopter passing overhead, a hopeful sign that rescue might be near. Hopeful after seeing the helicopter, Jessica gathers her strength to stand and walks, her determination pushing her forward until she reaches a clearing. Back at the wreck, the killer was revealed to still be alive, struggling to free himself from the debris. Jessica, clutching his phone, decides to make one final stand, and she calls the man his wife, and when she answers, she quickly reveals that her husband is not on a business trip, but is actually a serial killer. As she speaks, she sees the killer approaching in the distance, and she puts the call on the speaker, making sure he hears every word. The killer's face contorts with rage as he realizes that his secret is exposed. Jessica stands her ground, and this infuriates the killer, and he immediately ends the call after Jessica throws the phone in his direction. They engage in a violent brawl, each fighting with every ounce of their strength, and she manages to land several powerful blows with the wrench, but the killer was relentless. At one point, he stabs her in the limb, nearly ending her life. Despite the excruciating pain, Jessica fights back, biting the wound on his arm, summoning the last of her strength. She stabs him deep in the gut, pinning him to the ground. Her body finally gives in to the exhaustion, and she collapses beside him, her eyes filled with a mixture of madness and relief as she witnesses the life ebb away from his body. And the movie concludes as Jessica looks at the helicopter hovering over her, and rescue was finally there.
And with that, the movie ends. We hope you enjoyed our recap. Like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing recaps. See you in the next one.